In the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal secrets echo through ancient stones, a moment occurred that would forever change how the world sees Princess Charlotte. What started as whispered criticism about her beloved great-grandmother's legacy became the catalyst for an extraordinary display of courage, wisdom, and unwavering loyalty from Britain's youngest royal defender. This is not just another royal tale of protocol and ceremony. This is the true story of how a young princess, barely in her teens, stood against the tide of modern criticism with the fierce determination of her ancestors, proving that sometimes the most powerful voices come from the most unexpected places. A palace guard sworn to silence for years finally breaks his oath to reveal what really happened behind closed doors when Princess Charlotte decided that enough was enough. Prepare to witness a side of the royal family you've never seen before. Raw, authentic, and deeply human. This is the story of how one young girl's love for her great-grandmother became a masterclass in dignity, respect, and the true meaning of royal duty. Thomas Mitchell had served the royal family for 23 years, and in all that time, he had never broken his oath of silence. The gray-haired guard, now retired and living quietly in a small cottage in the Cotswolds, had witnessed countless private moments, family celebrations, and intimate conversations that the public would never know about. He had seen princes learn to walk, princesses take their first steps into public life, and generations of royals navigate the delicate balance between duty and humanity. But on this particular autumn evening, as rain drummed against his cottage windows and the fire crackled in the hearth, Thomas found himself unable to remain silent any longer. The story that had been weighing on his conscience for months finally demanded to be told. It was a story about Princess Charlotte, the young daughter of Prince William, and a moment that revealed the depth of character hidden beneath her youthful exterior. The events that Thomas was about to reveal had taken place during what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning at Kensington Palace. The media had been particularly harsh in recent weeks, with various commentators and social media personalities questioning the relevance of the monarchy in modern times. Some had gone so far as to criticize Queen Elizabeth's legacy, suggesting that her long reign had been nothing more than expensive pageantry that Britain could no longer afford. Princess Charlotte, then 12 years old, had been unusually quiet that morning. Thomas had noticed her walking through the palace corridors with a serious expression, her usual bright smile replaced by a thoughtful frown. She carried herself with the same dignity that had become her trademark, but there was something different about her demeanor that caught the experienced guard's attention. The palace was bustling with its usual morning activity. Staff members moved efficiently through the halls, preparing for the day's events. Prince William was in meetings with his private secretary, discussing upcoming royal engagements. Princess Kate was reviewing plans for a charity visit scheduled for the following week. Prince George was at school, and Prince Louis was with his tutor. But Charlotte had remained at the palace that day due to a slight fever that had kept her home from her own classes. Thomas had been stationed near the blue drawing room when he first noticed Charlotte's unusual behavior. She had been sitting quietly on one of the antique chairs, her tablet in her hands, scrolling through what appeared to be news articles. Her expression grew darker with each passing moment, and Thomas could see her jaw tightening in a way that reminded him remarkably of her great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, when she was displeased. The young princess had always been known for her intelligence and maturity beyond her years. Palace staff often remarked on her quick wit and her ability to understand complex situations that most children her age would find confusing. She had inherited not only her great-grandmother's sense of duty, but also her sharp mind and unwavering moral compass. As Thomas watched from his position, he noticed that Charlotte had begun taking notes on a piece of paper. She would read something on her tablet, pause thoughtfully, and then write down her thoughts. Her handwriting was careful and deliberate, each word chosen with precision. The guard had seen many royals in deep contemplation over the years, but there was something particularly intense about Charlotte's concentration that morning. The palace around them continued its quiet hum of activity. Housekeeping staff moved silently through adjacent rooms, ensuring that every detail was perfect. The sound of distant telephone conversations from various offices created a gentle backdrop of professional efficiency. Outside, the gardens of Kensington Palace displayed their autumn colors, a beautiful tapestry of gold, red, and brown leaves that danced in the morning breeze. Charlotte's tablet suddenly chimed with a notification. and Thomas watched as her expression shifted from concentration to what could only be described as controlled anger. She set the device aside and stood up, pacing slowly across the room. Her movements were measured and purposeful, never hurried, but carrying an energy that suggested important decisions were being made. The young princess stopped in front of one of the room's large windows, gazing out at the gardens where she had played countless times with her brothers. Thomas could see her reflection in the glass, and what he observed there was not the face of a child, but the determined expression of someone far older and wiser. It was as if, in that moment, Charlotte had stepped fully into her role as a defender of her family's legacy. Thomas had served long enough to recognize the signs of royal determination. He had seen it in Queen Elizabeth when she faced difficult decisions, in Prince Philip when he stood by his family, and in Prince William when he navigated challenging periods in his life. Now he was witnessing that same resolute spirit in the youngest member of the family. The guard's years of experience had taught him to observe without intruding, to be present without being noticed, and to understand the weight of the moments he was privileged to witness. What he was seeing now felt significant in a way that went beyond typical family dynamics. This was a young person grappling with concepts of legacy, duty, and the responsibility that came with her position. Charlotte returned to her seat and picked up her tablet again, but this time her interaction with it was different. She was no longer simply reading, she was researching. Thomas could see her switching between different applications, taking more notes, and occasionally pausing to look up at the portraits of her ancestors that lined the walls of the room. The blue drawing room held particular significance in royal history. It was where many important family discussions had taken place over the years, where decisions that would affect the monarchy for generations had been made. The room's blue silk wall coverings and magnificent portraits created an atmosphere of dignity and tradition that seemed to inspire serious contemplation. As the morning progressed, Thomas noticed that Charlotte's research had become more focused. She was no longer randomly browsing through articles, but was clearly looking for specific information. Her note-taking had become more organized, and she had begun creating what appeared to be an outline or plan. The intensity of her concentration was remarkable for someone her age. The palace's morning routine continued around them. Staff members occasionally passed through the corridor outside the blue drawing room, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. The distant sound of kitchen activity suggested that preparations for lunch were beginning. Telephone calls from various royal offices created a subtle symphony of efficient communication. Thomas had positioned himself where he could maintain his security duties while keeping a discreet eye on the young princess. His training had taught him to be aware of everything happening in his assigned area, but his experience had taught him to recognize when something extraordinary was taking place. This was clearly one of those moments. Charlotte suddenly closed her tablet and gathered her papers, organizing them into a neat pile. She stood up with the kind of purposeful movement that indicated a decision had been reached. Thomas watched as she walked toward the door, but instead of leaving the room immediately, she paused and turned back to look at the portraits on the walls. For several minutes, she stood silently in front of the official portrait of Queen Elizabeth that hung prominently in the room. The painting depicted the Queen in her younger years, wearing the George IV state diadem and the blue sash of the Order of the Garter. Charlotte's gaze was intense and focused, as if she was having a silent conversation with her great-grandmother. When Charlotte finally turned away from the portrait, Thomas could see that her expression had changed once again. The anger he had observed earlier had been replaced by something else entirely, a calm determination that seemed to radiate strength and purpose. She walked toward the door with her head held high and her shoulders straight, every inch the young royal she had been born to be. As she reached the doorway, Charlotte paused and looked back at Thomas. For a moment, their eyes met, and the guard was struck by the maturity he saw there. This was not the gaze of a 12-year-old child, but the steady, measured look of someone who had made an important decision and was prepared to act on it. "Thomas," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same clarity and authority that characterized her great-grandmother's speech, "would you please ask my father to meet me in his study when his meetings are finished? Tell him it's about Gangan." The use of her pet name for Queen Elizabeth told Thomas everything he needed to know about the nature of Charlotte's request. This was not a casual conversation she was seeking, but something much more significant. He nodded respectfully and watched as the young princess walked away, her footsteps confident and purposeful as they echoed through the corridor. Thomas had witnessed many pivotal moments in royal history, but he instinctively knew that what he had just observed was the beginning of something important. Princess Charlotte had clearly reached a decision about how to respond to the criticism of her great-grandmother's legacy, and whatever she had planned was about to set events in motion that would surprise everyone who thought they knew the quiet, well-mannered young princess. As he watched her disappear around the corner, Thomas found himself thinking about the remarkable transformation he had witnessed. In the span of a single morning, he had observed a young girl evolve into a determined defender of her family's honor. The question that remained was what form that defense would take, and how the rest of the royal family would respond to Charlotte's obvious determination to take action. The blue drawing room seemed to hold its breath in the aftermath of Charlotte's departure, as if the very walls understood the significance of what had just transpired. Thomas remained at his post, but his mind was filled with anticipation for what would happen next. In his 23 years of service, he had never seen anything quite like the quiet revolution he had just witnessed beginning to unfold. Prince William's study at Kensington Palace was a sanctuary of calm efficiency, where the future king conducted much of his private business away from the formal meeting rooms. The walls were lined with books on history, politics, and conservation, reflecting his diverse interests and responsibilities. Family photographs shared space with official documents, creating a perfect blend of personal and professional life that characterized William's approach to royal duty. When Thomas delivered Charlotte's message, Prince William had just finished a lengthy video conference with officials from the Earthshot Prize, his environmental initiative. His private secretary, James Harrison, was gathering papers from the meeting when the guard's words caused both men to pause. The mention of Gan in connection with Charlotte's request immediately elevated the importance of whatever the young princess wanted to discuss. William dismissed James and asked that he not be disturbed unless there was an emergency. He straightened his tie, cleared his desk of unnecessary papers, and settled into his chair to wait for his daughter. Years of experience as both a royal and a father had taught him that when Charlotte requested a formal meeting rather than simply appearing at his side as she usually did, the matter was serious. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the rich carpet that bore the Prince of Wales' feathers. The room's atmosphere was both intimate and dignified, perfectly suited for the kind of conversation William sensed was about to take place. He had learned to read his children's moods and motivations with the same skill he applied to understanding complex political situations. Charlotte entered the study precisely 15 minutes later, and William immediately noticed the change in his daughter's demeanor. Gone was the casual confidence she usually displayed around family. Instead, she moved with a formality that reminded him powerfully of his late grandmother during her most serious moments. She carried a folder containing her research and notes, holding it with the careful attention one might give to state documents. "Papa," she said, using the formal address she reserved for official occasions rather than her usual dad, "thank you for making time to see me. I know you're very busy." William gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where he had sat countless times as a child when his own father needed to have important conversations with him. "Of course, Charlotte. Thomas said this was about Gan. What's troubling you?" Charlotte settled into the chair with perfect posture, her folder placed neatly on her lap. William was struck by how much she resembled her mother in moments of serious concentration, but her expression carried something distinctly her own, a steel-like determination that seemed to come from somewhere deep within. "I've been reading what people are saying about Gan's legacy," Charlotte began, her voice steady and clear. "Some of the things being written are not just wrong, Papa. They're cruel and disrespectful, and they show that people don't understand what she really accomplished or why it mattered." William leaned forward slightly, recognizing that his daughter was not seeking comfort or reassurance, but rather preparing to propose some kind of action. "What specifically has upset you, Charlotte?" She opened her folder and removed several pages of handwritten notes, organized with the kind of methodical precision that reminded William of his grandmother's approach to correspondence. "I've been tracking the criticism across different platforms and publications. There are three main arguments that keep appearing, and they're all based on misconceptions about what the monarchy actually does." The fact that Charlotte had approached this like a research project rather than an emotional response impressed William enormously. She had clearly inherited the royal ability to analyze problems systematically before proposing solutions. He watched as she consulted her notes with the seriousness of a seasoned diplomat. "The first argument," Charlotte continued, "is that Gangan was just a figurehead who lived in luxury while ordinary people struggled. But that completely ignores the constitutional role she played, the stability she provided during decades of political and social change, and the way she modernized the monarchy while preserving its essential functions." William nodded, encouraging her to continue. He was fascinated by the depth of her analysis and the mature way she was presenting her arguments. The second criticism is that the royal family is too expensive and doesn't provide value for money. "But I've looked at the actual figures, Papa, and when you consider the tourism revenue, the soft diplomatic power, and the way royal patronage supports hundreds of charities, the economic argument doesn't hold up." Charlotte's research had clearly been thorough. William realized that his daughter had not only been reading criticism, but had also been seeking out factual information to counter it. This was not the emotional response of a hurt grandchild, but the reasoned analysis of someone who understood the complexity of the issues involved. The third point that keeps coming up is that monarchy is an outdated institution that has no place in modern democracy, but those people don't seem to understand that Gangan never saw herself as separate from democracy. She saw her role as protecting it, providing continuity that allowed democratic institutions to function effectively even during periods of political uncertainty. William sat back in his chair, genuinely impressed by his daughter's grasp of constitutional theory. These were concepts that many adults struggled to understand, yet Charlotte was discussing them with remarkable clarity and sophistication. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into this," William said carefully. "What do you think should be done about it?" Charlotte straightened even further, if that was possible, and William recognized the expression on her face. It was the same look his grandmother had worn when she was about to announce a decision that others might find surprising, but that she had determined was absolutely necessary. "I want to write a public response," Charlotte said simply, not as a child defending her great-grandmother, but as someone who has studied the facts and wants to set the record straight. "I think if people understood what Gangan really did, what she really accomplished, they would see that the criticism is unfair and historically inaccurate." William felt a moment of parental pride mixed with professional concern. The idea of his 12-year-old daughter entering into public debate about complex constitutional issues was both admirable and potentially problematic. The media attention alone would be enormous, and there were protocols to consider, not to mention the potential impact on Charlotte herself. "That's a significant undertaking," William said diplomatically. "Have you thought about the implications of taking a public position on this issue?" Charlotte's response demonstrated that she had indeed considered the broader ramifications. "I know it would attract attention, Papa, and I know some people might say I'm too young to understand these issues properly. But I also know that Gangan would expect us to defend what's right, even when it's difficult." The mention of Queen Elizabeth's expectations struck William deeply. His grandmother had indeed believed strongly in the importance of duty over personal comfort, of doing what was right regardless of the potential cost. Charlotte was invoking not just family loyalty, but the core values that had guided the monarchy for decades. What form would this response take? William asked, beginning to engage seriously with his daughter's proposal, rather than simply trying to understand it. Charlotte consulted her notes again. "I've been thinking about writing an essay that could be published in one of the serious newspapers. Not a children's opinion piece, but something that addresses the actual arguments being made with real facts and historical context. I want people to understand that defending Gangan's legacy isn't about blind family loyalty. It's about historical accuracy and fairness." William realized that his daughter was proposing something unprecedented. Royal children typically remained completely out of public discourse until they were much older and had completed their education. For Charlotte to enter the debate at 12 would represent a significant departure from established practice. But as he listened to her speak, William also recognized something else. Charlotte was not asking for permission to defend her great-grandmother. She was informing him of her intention to do so, and seeking his support for the most effective way to proceed. There was a quiet determination in her manner that suggested she would find a way to respond to the criticism regardless of whether the family approved her chosen method. "You understand that once you put something like this into the public sphere, you can't take it back," William said gently. "You would be entering a world of public scrutiny that most adults find challenging." Charlotte nodded solemnly. I understand, Papa, but I also understand that some things are more important than personal comfort. Gangan taught us that, didn't she? She spent 70 years putting duty before personal preference. I can handle whatever criticism comes my way if it means defending her legacy properly. William felt a surge of admiration for his daughter's courage and conviction. At the same time, he was acutely aware of his responsibilities as both her father and as someone charged with protecting the monarchy's future. Charlotte's proposal was bold and principled, but it also carried significant risks. What does your mother think about this? William asked, knowing that Catherine's input would be crucial in any decision about Charlotte's public role. I haven't spoken to Mama yet, Charlotte admitted. I wanted to discuss it with you first because it relates to your grandmother and your family's history. But I know she'll have concerns about the media attention and the impact on my education and normal development. William appreciated his daughter's tactical thinking. She understood that different family members would have different perspectives and had chosen to approach them strategically. It was another sign of the mature thinking that seemed to characterize everything about her approach to this issue. I need to think about this carefully, William said finally. And we need to discuss it with your mother, and possibly with others in the family. This isn't just a personal decision. It would affect how the entire royal family is perceived and how we handle public criticism going forward. Charlotte nodded, clearly having expected this response. I understand that, Papa. But while everyone is thinking and discussing, Gangan's reputation is being attacked every day. Sometimes waiting for the perfect solution means missing the opportunity to do what's right. William was struck by the wisdom in his daughter's words. Queen Elizabeth herself had often spoken about the importance of timely action, of not allowing problems to fester while committees debated the ideal response. Charlotte was channeling not just her great-grandmother's values, but also her practical approach to leadership. The conversation continued for another hour, with William asking detailed questions about Charlotte's research, her proposed arguments, and her understanding of the potential consequences. With each exchange, he became more impressed by the depth of her preparation and the sophistication of her thinking. As the afternoon light began to fade, William realized that his daughter had presented him with something remarkable, a fully developed plan based on serious research, careful analysis, and a clear understanding of both the opportunities and risks involved. This was not a child's impulsive response to criticism, but a young person's thoughtful proposal for meaningful action. When Charlotte finally left his study, William sat in contemplation for a long time. He was facing a decision that could change his daughter's life and potentially alter the way the royal family engaged with public discourse. But he was also confronting the reality that Charlotte had inherited something precious from her great-grandmother. Not just a sense of duty, but the courage to act on principle even when the path ahead was uncertain. The private family meeting took place 3 days later in the Oak Room at Kensington Palace, a space traditionally reserved for the most sensitive royal discussions. Catherine arrived first, having spent the previous evening reading through Charlotte's research materials with the careful attention she had once brought to analyzing art history texts at university. Prince William followed, carrying additional documents he had requested from the palace's constitutional experts. King Charles had made the journey from Highgrove specifically for this meeting, understanding that his granddaughter's proposal represented something far more significant than a typical family discussion. Queen Camilla accompanied him, recognizing that decisions about royal children's public roles required input from all senior family members. The gravity of the situation was reflected in everyone's formal attire and serious demeanor. Charlotte herself was the last to enter, dressed in a navy blue dress that seemed to emphasize her transformation from child to thoughtful young woman. She carried her research folder with the same careful attention she had shown during her initial conversation with William, but her confidence had grown noticeably over the past few days. She greeted each family member with perfect formality before taking her designated seat at the polished oak table. Thomas Mitchell, still maintaining his security position despite his growing fascination with the unfolding drama, observed from the corridor as the family gathering began. The weight of history seemed to settle over the room, as if the very furniture understood that decisions made here would ripple through future generations of royal service and public engagement. King Charles opened the discussion by acknowledging the unique nature of their gathering. "We're here to consider something unprecedented," he said, his voice carrying both pride and concern. "Charlotte has presented us with a proposal that is both admirable in its motivation and challenging in its implications. I want each of us to speak honestly about both the opportunities and the risks involved." Catherine was the first to respond, her words reflecting the careful balance between maternal protection and respect for her daughter's principles. "I'm enormously proud of Charlotte's research and her desire to defend her great-grandmother's legacy. The depth of her analysis and the sophistication of her arguments demonstrate a remarkable understanding of complex issues." She paused, consulting her own notes before continuing. "However, I'm deeply concerned about exposing a 12-year-old to the level of public scrutiny that would inevitably follow. The media attention would be intense and potentially overwhelming, and once Charlotte enters the public discourse in this way, there's no going back to a normal childhood." Charlotte listened respectfully but then asked permission to respond. "Mama, I understand your concerns, and I know they come from love and a desire to protect me. But I think we need to consider whether a normal childhood is really possible for any of us. I'm already in the public eye simply because of who I am. The question is whether I use that position to do something meaningful or simply try to hide from it." William noted the careful way his daughter had framed her argument, acknowledging her mother's concerns while gently challenging the assumptions underlying them. It was a diplomatic approach that showed remarkable emotional intelligence. Queen Camilla spoke next, bringing her perspective as someone who had experienced the challenges of entering royal life as an adult. "Charlotte, your desire to defend your great-grandmother is deeply moving, and your research is impressive. But public life can be brutal, especially for young people. Once you become a target for criticism, it's very difficult to escape that role." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully before responding. "I appreciate that warning, and I know there would be criticism. But I've been thinking about Gang's example. She faced criticism throughout her reign, sometimes very harsh criticism, but she never let that stop her from doing what she believed was right. If I'm going to inherit her legacy, shouldn't I also inherit her courage?" King Charles leaned forward, clearly moved by his granddaughter's words. "Your great-grandmother would indeed be proud of your willingness to defend her legacy. But she would also want us to consider the long-term implications of your entering public discourse at such a young age. The monarchy's strength comes from its continuity and stability, and those qualities require careful nurturing." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with each family member raising different aspects of Charlotte's proposal. William discussed the constitutional implications of a royal child taking public positions on controversial issues. Catherine explored the educational and psychological considerations of exposing Charlotte to intense media scrutiny. Charles examined the historical precedents and potential impact on future royal protocols. Throughout these discussions, Charlotte listened carefully, took notes, and responded to each concern with thoughtful consideration. She never dismissed anyone's worries as unimportant, but she consistently returned to her central argument, that defending truth and historical accuracy was worth the personal risks involved. The turning point in the conversation came when Charlotte was asked directly about her long-term goals. "This isn't just about writing one essay," she explained. "I want people to understand that the monarchy can be both traditional and modern, both respectful of history and relevant to contemporary life." Gangan showed us how to do that, and I think her example is more important now than ever. She consulted her notes before continuing. "The criticism we're seeing isn't just about Gangan personally. It's part of a broader questioning of institutions, traditions, and the value of continuity in a rapidly changing world. If we don't respond thoughtfully and factually, we're essentially allowing others to define our legacy for us." William recognized his grandmother's strategic thinking in Charlotte's words. Queen Elizabeth had always understood that silence could be interpreted as acceptance, and that sometimes active defense of principles was necessary, even when it carried risks. Catherine asked about the specific form Charlotte's response might take. "Have you thought about alternatives to a published essay? There might be ways to defend your great-grandmother's legacy that don't require such direct public engagement." Charlotte had clearly anticipated this question. "I've considered other approaches, but I think they would be less effective. A formal statement through palace communications would be dismissed as official spin. An interview would focus more on me personally than on the substantive issues. A written piece allows me to present the facts systematically and let people judge the arguments on their merits." King Charles inquired about the specific publications Charlotte had in mind for her essay. Her response demonstrated that she had researched this aspect as thoroughly as everything else. "I think it should be published in a serious newspaper with a reputation for thoughtful analysis rather than sensationalism. Something like The Times or The Telegraph, where the focus would be on the content rather than on the novelty of a royal child expressing opinions." Queen Camilla raised questions about ongoing media attention after publication. "Once you publish something like this, journalists will want to interview you about other issues. How would you handle requests for your opinions on current political debates or social controversies?" Charlotte's answer revealed that she had thought carefully about these implications. "I would make it clear that this essay is specifically about defending historical accuracy regarding Gangan's legacy. I wouldn't comment on current political issues or try to become a general commentator on public affairs. This is about setting the record straight on specific misconceptions, not about establishing myself as a voice on all royal matters." As the afternoon progressed, the family discussion became increasingly focused on practical considerations. If Charlotte's proposal was approved, how would it be managed? Who would review her draft before publication? How would the palace communications team handle the inevitable media response? What support systems would be put in place to help Charlotte deal with any negative reactions? William suggested that Charlotte might benefit from working with a constitutional historian to ensure her arguments were historically accurate and properly contextualized. Catherine proposed involving a child psychologist to help prepare Charlotte for the emotional challenges of public criticism. Charles recommended coordination with the palace communications team to manage the broader implications for royal protocol. Charlotte accepted all these suggestions gracefully, understanding that they represented support for her proposal rather than obstacles to it. She recognized that her family's concerns came from love and experience, and that their expertise would strengthen rather than weaken her eventual response. The discussion's climax came when King Charles asked Charlotte to articulate, in her own words, why this particular response was worth the risks involved. Her answer would ultimately determine whether the family supported her unprecedented venture into public discourse. Gangan spent 70 years showing us that duty means putting the greater good above personal comfort, Charlotte said, her voice steady and clear. She faced criticism, controversy, and personal attacks, but she never let those things stop her from serving her people and defending her principles. The criticism of her legacy isn't just unfair to her memory, it's historically inaccurate and potentially damaging to public understanding of how constitutional monarchy actually works. She paused, looking at each family member in turn. "I know there are risks involved in responding publicly, but I also know that silence can be interpreted as agreement, and I cannot agree with falsehoods about someone who meant so much to our family and our country. If I'm going to inherit her legacy, I need to be willing to defend it, even when doing so is difficult or uncomfortable." The room fell silent as Charlotte's words settled over the gathering. Thomas, observing from his position in the corridor, recognized the moment as a turning point. The young princess had articulated not just her personal feelings, but a philosophy of service that connected directly to the monarchy's deepest traditions. King Charles was the first to speak. "Your great-grandmother would be enormously proud of your courage and your commitment to truth. You've demonstrated remarkable maturity in your approach to this issue, and your arguments are both principled and well-reasoned." He paused before continuing. "However, this decision will affect not just you, but the entire royal family and the institution we all serve. I propose that we take additional time to consider all the implications, and to develop a comprehensive plan for supporting you if we decide to proceed." Charlotte nodded respectfully. "I understand, grandfather, but I hope we can reach a decision relatively quickly. Every day that passes allows the false narratives about Gangan to become more entrenched in public opinion." As the meeting concluded, family members began discussing next steps. William would consult with constitutional experts about the historical precedents and implications. Catherine would speak with child development specialists about the psychological considerations. Charles would review the proposal with senior palace officials. Queen Camilla would consider the broader impact on royal family dynamics and public perceptions. Charlotte gathered her materials with the same careful attention she had brought to the entire process. As she prepared to leave, she turned to address the group one final time. "Thank you all for listening to my proposal and for taking it seriously. I know this isn't a typical situation, but I don't think defending truth and historical accuracy should ever be considered typical. It should be considered necessary. Thomas watched as the family members filed out of the Oak Room, each carrying the weight of a decision that would shape not only Charlotte's future but potentially the monarchy's approach to public engagement for generations to come. The young princess had presented them with something unprecedented, a thoughtful, principled proposal for action that honored both tradition and innovation. As Charlotte passed his position in the corridor, Thomas was struck once again by the transformation he had witnessed over the past few days. The young girl who had begun this journey with quiet anger at unfair criticism had evolved into a thoughtful advocate for historical truth and institutional dignity. Whatever decision the family ultimately reached, Charlotte had already demonstrated the qualities that would serve her well in future royal service: courage, intelligence, principle, and an unwavering commitment to defending what she believed was right. The decision came exactly 1 week after the family meeting, delivered personally by King Charles during a private breakfast with Charlotte at Clarence House. The weeks of consultation with constitutional experts, child psychologists, and senior palace officials had resulted in qualified approval for Charlotte's proposal, with carefully structured support systems and clear boundaries around her future public engagement. Thomas Mitchell learned of the decision through the palace communications network, and he felt a surge of anticipation for what was about to unfold. In his decades of royal service, he had witnessed many significant moments, but he sensed that Princess Charlotte's public defense of Queen Elizabeth's legacy would represent something entirely unique in the modern history of the monarchy. The essay Charlotte had written, refined through multiple drafts with input from constitutional historians and communications experts, was scheduled for publication in the Times on a Saturday morning. The timing was strategic, allowing maximum readership while avoiding immediate political news cycles that might overshadow or distort her message. On the Friday evening before publication, Charlotte sat in her room at Kensington Palace, reading through the final version of her essay one last time. The document represented weeks of research, writing, and revision, but it still carried her authentic voice and passionate conviction. She had insisted on maintaining her own words and perspective throughout the editorial process, accepting guidance on historical accuracy and constitutional details, while preserving the personal element that made her defense so compelling. William and Catherine had spent the evening with Charlotte, discussing the likely public reaction, and reminding her of the support systems available if the response became overwhelming. They had arranged for a trusted communications advisor to monitor media coverage and social media reaction, filtering any particularly harsh criticism before it reached Charlotte directly. The essay itself was structured as a systematic response to the three main criticisms Charlotte had identified in her original research. She began with a personal reflection on her relationship with Queen Elizabeth, establishing her emotional connection to the subject while making clear that her arguments would be based on facts rather than sentiment. "My great-grandmother was many things to many people," Charlotte had written. "To me, she was gone, who taught me to ride horses, explained the importance of service, and showed me that duty and love for one's country could be the same thing. To millions of others, she was Queen Elizabeth II, who provided stability and continuity through decades of social, political, and economic change. But to her critics today, she seems to be a symbol of everything they believe is wrong with tradition, hierarchy, and inherited responsibility." The essay continued with a detailed examination of Queen Elizabeth's constitutional role, explaining how her function as head of state had evolved and adapted over 7 decades. Charlotte cited specific examples of the Queen's interventions during constitutional crises, her role in facilitating smooth transitions of government, and her work in modernizing royal protocols while preserving essential traditions. "The criticism that my great-grandmother was merely a figurehead living in luxury ignores the reality of what constitutional monarchy actually requires," Charlotte wrote. She worked every day, reading government papers, meeting with officials, representing Britain internationally, and supporting hundreds of charities and organizations. Her schedule was relentless, her dedication absolute, and her impact immeasurable. The second section addressed economic arguments against the monarchy, with Charlotte presenting detailed figures about tourism revenue, diplomatic benefits, and the financial efficiency of royal institutions compared to alternative systems. She had consulted with economists and constitutional experts to ensure her data was accurate and her analysis sound. When critics claim that the monarchy is too expensive, they ignore the comprehensive economic benefits it provides, Charlotte argued. The revenue generated by royal tourism alone exceeds the cost of supporting royal institutions, and that doesn't account for the soft diplomatic power that helps British businesses succeed internationally or the way royal patronage amplifies charitable fundraising efforts. The essay's most sophisticated section dealt with arguments about democracy and modern relevance. Charlotte addressed these concerns by explaining the monarchy's role in protecting democratic institutions rather than threatening them, citing examples from countries with different systems to support her analysis. The idea that inherited monarchy is incompatible with modern democracy misunderstands both institutions, she wrote. My great-grandmother never saw herself as above democracy, but as its servant, providing the continuity and stability that allowed democratic institutions to function effectively even during periods of political uncertainty. She was a neutral figure who could represent all citizens regardless of their political affiliations. Charlotte concluded her essay with a personal reflection on legacy and responsibility that revealed remarkable maturity and insight for someone her age. Defending my great-grandmother's legacy isn't about blind family loyalty or resistance to change, she wrote. It's about ensuring that historical truth prevails over political convenience, that institutional knowledge is preserved and valued, and that the lessons learned from 70 years of dedicated service aren't lost to contemporary criticism based on misconceptions rather than facts. The morning of publication brought intense anticipation throughout the palace. Staff members who had followed Charlotte's journey from initial anger to thoughtful advocacy waited eagerly to see how the public would respond to such an unprecedented intervention from a royal child. Thomas Mitchell was among the first to read the published essay, obtaining an early copy of the Times as soon as it became available. As he read Charlotte's words in print, he was struck by their power and clarity. The young princess had succeeded in creating something that was simultaneously personal and analytical, emotional and factual, traditional and innovative. The initial public response was overwhelmingly positive, with constitutional experts praising Charlotte's grasp of complex issues and her balanced approach to controversial topics. Social media reaction was more mixed, as expected, but even critics acknowledged the sophistication of her arguments and the courage required to enter such a public debate at her age. Television news programs throughout Saturday featured discussions of Charlotte's essay, with historians and political commentators analyzing both her arguments and the broader implications of her public intervention. The consensus among serious observers was that she had made a significant contribution to public understanding of constitutional monarchy while demonstrating remarkable intellectual maturity. International media coverage was equally extensive, with newspapers around the world noting the unprecedented nature of Charlotte's defense and the quality of her research and writing. Foreign constitutional experts commented on her analysis of democratic institutions, while royal correspondents focused on what her public role might mean for the future of the monarchy. The palace communications team monitored reactions carefully, ready to provide additional support if Charlotte faced particularly harsh criticism. However, the overall response was far more positive than anyone had anticipated. Even Republicans who disagreed with Charlotte's conclusions acknowledged her right to defend her family's legacy and praised the thoughtfulness of her approach. Charlotte herself spent Saturday quietly with her family, deliberately avoiding news coverage and social media reaction. William and Catherine had arranged for a normal day of family activities, recognizing that their daughter needed space to process the significance of what she had accomplished without being overwhelmed by public response. The essay's impact extended far beyond immediate media coverage. Constitutional law professors began incorporating Charlotte's arguments into their teaching materials. Historians cited her research in their own work on 20th-century monarchy. Political scientists referenced her analysis in discussions of democratic institutions and inherited leadership. More significantly, Charlotte's intervention changed the broader conversation about Queen Elizabeth's legacy. Critics found themselves needing to respond to her factual arguments rather than relying on general assertions about royal irrelevance. Supporters of the monarchy had been provided with sophisticated talking points that went far beyond traditional defenses based on tradition and sentiment. Thomas Mitchell observed the aftermath of Charlotte's essay with deep admiration for what the young princess had accomplished. She had transformed herself from an angry child reading criticism of her great-grandmother into a thoughtful advocate, capable of changing public discourse through careful research and principled argument. The week following publication brought numerous requests for interviews and follow-up commentary from Charlotte, all of which were politely declined according to the boundaries established before her essay appeared. She had made her statement, defended her position, and contributed to public understanding without becoming a regular commentator on political affairs. King Charles publicly praised his granddaughter's contribution during a subsequent engagement, noting that she had demonstrated the same commitment to service and truth that had characterized Queen Elizabeth's approach to public life. William and Catherine spoke privately about their pride in Charlotte's courage and sophistication, while acknowledging that her intervention had set precedents that would need to be carefully managed. The essay's publication also prompted broader discussions within the royal family about how younger members might contribute to public discourse in the future. Charlotte had shown that age did not necessarily preclude meaningful participation in important debates, but her example also highlighted the need for careful preparation and support when royal children engaged with controversial issues. For Charlotte herself, the experience represented a transformation that went beyond simply defending her great-grandmother's legacy. She had learned about research methodology, constitutional theory, public communications, and the responsibility that comes with having a platform for influencing public opinion. Most importantly, she had discovered that principled action based on careful analysis could make a genuine difference in public understanding. Thomas Mitchell's final observations focused on the broader significance of what he had witnessed. Princess Charlotte's journey from private anger to public advocacy represented something new in royal history. A young person who had successfully combined traditional royal values with contemporary methods of communication and engagement. The guard who had served the royal family for more than 2 decades recognized that he had observed the emergence of a new kind of royal voice. Charlotte had shown that defense of institutional values could be both passionate and analytical, both personal and factual. She had demonstrated that young people could contribute meaningfully to serious public discussions without compromising their dignity or their family's reputation. As Thomas reflected on the entire episode months later, he understood that Princess Charlotte's defense of Queen Elizabeth's legacy would be remembered as more than just a family member protecting a relative's reputation. It represented a new model for how royal institutions might engage with criticism and controversy. Through careful research, thoughtful analysis, and principled public discourse. The young princess who had begun this journey as an angry child reading unfair criticism had evolved into a thoughtful advocate, capable of changing public conversation through the power of facts, logic, and unwavering commitment to truth. She had honored her great-grandmother's memory, not through blind defense, but through the same qualities Queen Elizabeth herself had exemplified: duty, service, and absolute dedication to doing what was right, regardless of personal cost. Thomas Mitchell knew that he had been privileged to witness something extraordinary: the emergence of a new kind of royal leadership that combined traditional values with contemporary methods, personal conviction with public responsibility, and deep respect for the past with clear vision for the future. Princess Charlotte had shown that the monarchy's greatest strength lay not in avoiding controversy, but in engaging with it thoughtfully and courageously when fundamental principles were at stake. The story that had begun with a young girl's determination to defend her beloved great-grandmother had become something much larger. A demonstration that truth, carefully researched and courageously presented, could still change minds and influence public understanding in an age of rapid communication and instant opinions. Charlotte had proved that the values Queen Elizabeth embodied, service, duty, and unwavering commitment to truth, remained as relevant and powerful as ever when embraced by someone willing to act on them with intelligence, courage, and absolute conviction.